There are over 700,000 sexual offenders in the United States alone. With all the social media these days, how can we protect ourselves and our children from these despicable predators?
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast, where we discuss criminal cases that involve some factor of abuse. Our goal is to spread awareness of abuse that could be taking place around any of us and encourage everyone to take responsibility and report if they see a child or an adult being abused. It was January 15th, 1998 in Atlanta, Georgia. That evening, a 5-year-old boy arrived at Hughes Spalding Hospital in cardiac arrest. At 10:55 p.m., they pronounced him dead. As they looked at him, they discovered some horrific things. His little body was covered in bruises, cuts, and even fresh blood. The average 5-year-old weighs over 40 pounds, but Terrell only weighed 29 pounds. How could this child possibly have been in such rough shape? Alright.
Say good morning, Rosie.
Good morning, Rosie.
Good morning, Ryan.
I'm keeping that in just so you know.
The say good morning.
Well, we recorded this case before you went to Paris, but then I realized that the recording was really bad quality, and so I begged you to re-record it with me.
You didn't beg.
So we could have better quality sound for our listeners.
Oui, oui.
And so I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you. I am having jet lag issues, but I had 2 cups of coffee and I'm doing okay.
Awesome. Well, this is a case of a little boy who really never had a chance at a normal life. There's nowhere near enough knowledge or coverage of this case, because I looked it up on Apple Podcasts and YouTube, and I only found 2 YouTube videos mentioning this boy, and no podcasts at all. So this case involves a foster parenting situation gone way wrong, and a government agency failing to do their job. What else is new? I usually would start with the good parts of a victim's life first, or at least how they appeared to be good, but things were really never good for Terrell Peterson, so this whole case is going to be kind of sad. But so in 1992, Terrell was born with cocaine in his blood to a woman who was reportedly addicted to crack cocaine. During the pregnancy, there was an incident when the authorities were notified that the mother was taking drugs while pregnant. It's also reported that she was using food stamps and welfare money to buy crack. So this was just the first report out of 7 over the span of 1991 to 1995. Rosie, do you want to talk about the other times?
Sure. In August 1993, it was reported that the parents were locking the children in the bedroom on weekends and denying them food and water. And in February 1994, it was reported that the mother was on drugs and the children are unsupervised. January of 1995, children were begging neighbors for food, and the mother is using cocaine daily. Now, in November of 1995, the mother is addicted to crack cocaine and was leaving the children with their sickly grandmother.
Yeah, so these were a few of the reports that were filed, but despite all these reports of abuse and neglect, Terrell and his siblings remained with their mother, and the agency used the privacy laws that protect child abuse records to avoid notifying the people who called it in about the fact that they're basically doing nothing to respond to it. So later we'll talk more about how these reports were ignored. But do you want to talk about how they finally reacted to it?
So in June 1996, in response to the ongoing complaints, the Child Welfare Agency pressured the mother to sign over guardianship of the children to their paternal grandmother, Pharina Peterson, who was then 48. We mentioned that the mother would often leave Terrell with the grandmother while she was strung out on cocaine, And according to the protocol, children in the custody of CPS should ideally be placed with a blood relative. Also, they should receive at least one in-person visit with an agency caseworker per month. And no type of physical punishment should ever be administered by foster parents.
So Terrell's now living with the grandmother of his half-brother and half-sister.
So really, she's not a relative.
Yeah, she's not directly related to him.
Okay.
I guess she's the paternal grandmother of his half-brother.
siblings?
Yeah, because she's not the mom's parent.
Okay, that was
So-
kind of confusing in the videos.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is. Since there's so little information on this case, it was hard to put all of this stuff together and have it make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we can't get all the facts like 100% straight, the big facts are what we're focusing on, and the principles of why we're covering this case as Voice of the Victim podcast. So,
Right, there's the core story and the minor details.
yeah. So as we mentioned, the protocol was to have one monthly visit by a caseworker, but in Terrell's case, this rarely happened while he was living with Pharina, if ever. So now we're sitting about a year before the horrible events in the intro. He was in a Head Start schooling program.
Does that mean preschool?
Yeah, that's what I'm guessing. And one day, just before Thanksgiving in '96, his teacher Joanne Bryant found him digging around in a trash can at school. And she's like, "What are you doing? Why are you digging around in the garbage?" And he says, "I'm hungry. I'm looking for food." So the teacher ended up talking to his foster mother, Pharina, letting her know that Terrell was really hungry at school.
Didn't the excuse that was given to the school was that if he ate during the day, he would defecate himself?
Oh, yeah.
Which, I'm
Yeah,
just
they were
surprised
like,
that-
don't give him lunch because
Yeah.
he'll poop his pants, basically.
Shortly after this, on Thanksgiving Day, 1996, Terrell was beaten so badly that he needed to be taken to the ER, where he was diagnosed with battered children syndrome. Battered children syndrome was a term I wasn't sure what that meant, if it was something physical, like he had a side effect of seizures or something because of it. So I looked that up. And the definition is a disease in which children are physically abused. The battered children syndrome is a form of child abuse. So really it's just a label meaning that you are being abused. It's not like a
Okay.
real, there's no actual symptoms. But just to go on even further on my side note here, I did some more research, and not until the 19th century were children granted the same legal status as domesticated animals in regard to protection against cruelty or neglect.
Wow. Queso seems to have something to say about that.
Our cats are really vocal today. But I just couldn't believe that it took until the 19th century for children to have the same rights as a cow. Or,
Yeah.
domesticated animals on farms and households. And then in 1962, the term battered children syndrome entered medicine. And finally, by 1976, all states in the United States had adopted laws mandating the reporting of suspected instances of child abuse.
What year was that?
1976.
Wow. Which is fairly recent in the grand scheme of human history, but
Right.
crazy.
It goes hand in hand with what being a mandated reporter means, which we talked about in our last episode.
Yeah. Basically, we all have the responsibility to stick up for kids that are in these situations. Because as we'll go on in this case, we'll see so many instances of where people should have spoken up, should have done something, and they didn't, and it led to the outcome of this case.
Right. So anyways, the doctors asked Terrell who did this to him, and he told them that it was his foster mom, Pharina Peterson.
So thankfully, Pharina was arrested and indicted on misdemeanor charges for this. And Terrell was scheduled to testify in person against Pharina in trial. His caseworker, Cheryl Elmore, was supposed to pick him up and bring him to court that day.
Way to go, Cheryl.
But she never showed up. I think you should have waited till after I said that to say that. So she never showed up for Terrell to bring him into court. So Terrell missed his chance to testify against his abuser. And the judge, another champion of justice, Catherine E. Malachy, in a strange but apparently quote-unquote legal move, dismissed the charges on Pharina, citing the reason that the victim was not in court. So here's the part that's really messed up. Elmore, his caseworker who was supposed to bring him in, she intentionally covered up this giant mistake by creating a fraudulent, backdated internal memo that the trial did indeed occur and no evidence was found of child abuse. And this is why the charges were dismissed. So, according to Elmore, quote, the judge believed Miss Peterson and did not feel she was guilty of child abuse. So Elmore concocted this garbage and placed it into Terrell's file, where she could have admitted her mistake and made plans with the court to try to reschedule the hearing as his caseworker, but instead of protecting Terrell, she protected her own reputation, or so she thought.
Yeah, and
because a lot came out later.
This is totally against what being a servant of social services is.
Yeah.
I mean, their whole point of the job is to help others and give up, yourself.
Like, why did you even go to school for this and spend your life becoming this child protective caseworker if you're gonna treat kids like this?
If you're only protecting yourself. So, there were no court documents matching this report, and there was medical evidence and evidence from the police investigation showing the abuse, but Elmore's supervisors never questioned it, and as a result, Terrell was deemed to be safe, and his file was closed.
And major quotes around the word safe.
He was then returned to Pharina's custody.
Yeah. So he went through the legal system, and it let him down, and so this is where we're at. Terrell returned home with Pharina. So, later, he returned back to that Head Start class who had originally reported the abuse before, which, good for that teacher, who was the only one that was really looking out for him in this whole case, apparently. But his teacher noticed that he was walking kind of strangely, kind of like it hurt for him to step on his feet, and she had him sit down and took off his sneakers, and then she saw why he was in pain. The flesh was burned off the soles of both of his feet. When questioned, Terrell said that she was really mad that Terrell had gotten her arrested previously, and so she forced him to stand on a heating grate as punishment. Mm-hmm. His burns were so bad that he needed skin grafts. They actually had to take the skin from his hips and transplant it onto the soles of his feet. So now you're thinking, oh, they got her now. There's no way she'll get away with that. Well, despite the severity of these injuries, no investigation was ever done into this. No charges were brought, and Terrell was still not visited by anyone from Child Services between the time of this incident and his death a year later. Now we know, according to the protocol, the caseworkers should visit him once a month. So he should have had 12 visits in this time, and he had none. Do you have anything to say about that, Rosie?
Well, I do wonder the excuse that they made up for the burns on his feet. And also, it's shocking to me that he was able to walk around at all, if you think about not having any skin on the soles of your feet. No
kidding. Like, kind of like, when you rip the skin off the cuticle, or off of,
yeah,
when you bite that skin and it rips off a little too far and the burning pain you get.
I know.
If you have that covering the entire bottom of your foot, ugh.
Times 10. And it's hard to believe that anybody could be so cruel to a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And to watch, because I'm sure the process, it took like a couple minutes, or at least 30 seconds, so just to watch a little boy cry out in pain like that, it really makes you imagine what kind of monsters the grandma, and I believe the aunt was there too.
Yeah, the grandma and the aunt were his abusers. I'm wondering how he went into the hospital and got this skin graft surgery and no doctors reported it to the police.
Well, that's why I was asking about the excuse they came up with. 'Cause
Yeah.
it must have been a pretty good one.
Like I said, I wish there was more information on the background of these people and the details of this case, but there's just not.
This is what we got.
Yeah.
Also, the police weren't even called. So,
Yeah, about this incident.
it's such a strange incident to begin with that you just got to go with what you got.
And so what do we think Terrell is thinking at this point? He's already attempted to go through the legal system, and now he's back in the hospital with these burns, and they do nothing for him to help stop the abuse. So, a year later, after this incident, this poor boy was brought into the hospital in cardiac arrest like we described in the intro, and he died shortly thereafter. The coroner listed his cause of death as blunt impact injuries to the head, trunk, and extremities, which trunk, is that like torso?
It must be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, head, trunk, and extremities, that's everywhere.
It covers pretty much the whole body.
Yeah. The coroner said he couldn't place 2 fingers side by side on Terrell's body without touching a wound. So during this homicide investigation, the police found that Terrell had been physically restrained with pantyhose and tied to a banister in the apartment. Another one of the children living in the home, Tasha, this might be his half-sister, but it doesn't say, she reported that Terrell was tied up a lot. You want to read about that note?
The police also found a set of handwritten instructions for Terrell's care. The instructions say, he gets a bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, lunch he gets grits, and dinner he gets grits. His hands are always tied.
Not great treatment for a child. Like you were saying about having the same rights as animals, this is how Pharina seemed to view Terrell, was like her pet cat or something. But according to a subsequent internal investigation by the state, because the welfare agency, they did their own investigation, and then the state did an investigation where we actually found the truth. But throughout the family's involvement with the Fulton Child Welfare Agency, there were 11 caseworkers, overseen by 10 supervisors, handling these complaints that were called in over the course of Terrell's life. And the investigation found that many caseworkers violated the internal guidelines for investigating abuse and neglect reports. Like, for instance, no one required drug tests for the parents, even though drugs were at the core of the complaints, which is surprising, because with the war on drugs, usually
That's the first thing.
Yeah, usually they jump on that. But they also never checked criminal histories, even though they had reason to believe there was one. Some caseworkers never saw or interviewed the children, even though Terrell and his siblings were old enough to talk. And they often failed to get pertinent medical records or check with others who may have witnessed the abuse. So, based on that, we know the murder is not the end of the story here.
So can I go over exactly all the abuse accounts that happened?
Yes, please.
The day that he died, it was said that he was being fed by his aunt or his grandma, and he told his grandma, his relative, that he was hungry, or he told his relative that he was tired, and then 45 minutes after that, he went into cardiac arrest and died. The coroner said that he wasn't sure what the cause of death was because there was so much abuse involved, but they thought it was blood force trauma to the head that most likely was the actual core cause. He had been beaten by telephone cords, belts, a dog collar, and shoes. He had cigarette burns covering his body, swollen lips from being force-fed. He was tied to this banister like we talked about with pantyhose, and he slept on a pallet in the hallway. So
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
With no mattress or anything, just a pallet with blankets, or
We don't have the details, but just a pallet.
It
I don't
must
know.
have been just a pallet.
That's pretty much all I got.
So,
Never mind.
Terrell was only 5 years old when he died, and he was in cardiac arrest. Imagine the amount of trauma it takes for a 5-year-old to go into cardiac arrest. Usually people are in their 60s or 70s when they start having heart problems like this. But, it's often said, because of the link between emotions, anxiety, and actual physical health, that it is possible to die of a broken heart,
Mm-hmm.
And Terrell's been through so much, and the authorities keep letting him down. He could have just felt so dejected and hopeless that he just didn't want to live anymore.
Yeah, it's really sad.
But, so, back to this agency. As we know, Terrell's accused killers were not the only players in this child's short life. In response to the recurring signs of neglect and abuse, dozens of government, hospital, and criminal justice workers drifted in and out of Terrell's life and saw him and his abuse, but their actions have been kept secret in records that only became public in response to a court petition filed by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Their records tell a story of torture and death that may have been prevented at a number of points. There was a sloppy investigation by the Fulton County Department and the Family and Children's Services, where they basically were investigating themselves, in 7 complaints that Terrell and his 2 siblings were victims of neglect and abuse. Then the hospital personnel did not alert child protection workers when the boy was hospitalized with 3rd-degree burns, when we know he got his feet burned off. Then Terrell told authorities that his grandmother beat him a year before he died, but a judge dismissed the criminal charges against her when no one brought the child to court. So that's a failure of the caseworker and the judge. And then the government agency's highest officials told the public they had done everything possible to save Terrell, but 2 state investigations found otherwise. Now, there was a spokeswoman for the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, Joyce Goldberg, and she defended the Child Welfare Agency, saying that the state gives first-rate care to the vast majority of children needing its help. But she said, cases like Terrell's hurt the agency's credibility. How freaking sad is that?
Yeah.
When something, hold on. Oh, this is a quote. It said, when something like this happens, your readers might readily jump to the conclusion that all cases are handled this way and then covered up, said Goldberg, now the director of communications for Georgia's new Department of Community Health. And I don't think that's true. It's so sad that instead of showing remorse and regret for the way this case was handled, that she's more worried about the credibility of the department. Terrell wasn't even the only victim of this failure of a department to run properly.
Yeah, he was one of more than 800 children who died between 1995 and 1998 after their cases were brought to the attention of the Georgia Department of Human Services.
So they did their best to cover up their own failures. According to 2 internal investigations that we were just talking about, the Children's Services behavior was noted as they failed to make contacts with the children they're supposed to be protecting. We know they didn't do the monthly visits like they were supposed to. There was a serious lack of judgment and numerous violations throughout the history of the case. Despite the findings, the department officials engaged in a cover-up and issued one public statement by Ralph Mitchell, who was the administrator of the Atlanta area office. But these were internal investigations, and the public was not told of them. So after the investigations, department officials decided to cover up what they had done.
Don Keenan, one of the workers who did his own investigation on this case, was suing the state of Georgia in Terrell's behalf, and he said, "I think anybody who would have known or understood what this little guy was going through would rejoice in his death."
Ugh.
So that quote in itself, it just shows how deep his abuse was, and
Yeah.
how, I mean, who would think to rejoice in someone's death? But if you're going through this much pain on a daily basis, then maybe it was better just to fall asleep in death and go through it over and over and over again your whole life.
How sad. So I mentioned that the department made only one public statement. It was written by Ralph Mitchell, who was, we mentioned, the administrator of the Atlanta area office. His statement was that the agency expressed outrage at the loss of precious life, but that they had responded immediately and comprehensively to allegations of Terrell's abuse and had followed protocol. All of its steps were followed in the case of Terrell. And then he wrote a private memo to the department head at the state headquarters stating that the press release was untrue, but that fortunately no one in the media had called to follow up. This is lies, saying that they did it. They responded immediately and comprehensively and followed protocol. It's just not true, because if true, Terrell would still be alive and Pharina would have gone to prison a year before Terrell died. But thanks to the willful neglect of the Georgia Department of Family and Children's Services and this cover-up, all this went down. Not a good situation for him. So let's talk about the aftermath. Pharina Peterson received a life sentence for Terrell's murder. Thank goodness. In December 2002, Terry Lynn Peterson, the victim's aunt, was found guilty of his murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. So both of his abusers are behind bars. So it is a good turnout in that way, but this boy's death could have been avoided every step of the way. Now, Ralph Mitchell, who engaged in the cover-up that we discussed and the phony press release, he retired with a state pension, so he had absolutely no punishment. He's living the dream now. And Catherine Malicki, she was the judge who dismissed the charges against Pharina Peterson because Terrell wasn't at court. She's still a municipal court judge in Atlanta. And then Roy Barnes, who was the governor that signed the Terrell Peterson Act, he ran for Georgia governor again in 2010, but he lost. So basically, the villains in this case were rewarded, and the guy who actually did something about this case and was inspired, who signed the Terrell Peterson Act, he lost his next election. So do you want to talk about what the Terrell Peterson Act was?
Yeah, the Terrell Peterson Act, one of the good things that came out of this case, allows doctors who believe children are being abused can temporarily be put in their care. Although I don't think this act is used very often, at least it gives the doctors the power to do what's right.
Yeah, take custody if
needed.
So, yeah, that's one of the only good things that came out of this case. And the reason we want to cover this case is because it's so seems to be swept under the rug how many things government agencies can get away with and there's no repercussions for it. Like I said, Ralph Mitchell retired with a state pension, so all of our tax money is going towards these government agencies and all kinds of stuff, but that's money from the people that are paying to have these systems in place where these kids can get help, and now he's got his state pension, and he's retired, even though he blatantly lied about the internal workings of a government agency And government agencies, their job is to serve the public. They're not a private organization. They're not a business. They shouldn't be a business, even though the government runs them like one. But this is how the people get away with doing a really terrible job. Do you have anything to say about this case?
It just highlights all the things that are wrong with the CPS.
Yeah.
Terrell's headstone was paid by his attorney, and sadly, next to none or no mourners showed up for his burial. This little boy was really forgotten about and lost in the system. So I think it's important for podcasts like us, or just anybody, to recognize that he was alive at one time and to recognize the abuse that he went through.
Yeah. So hopefully this episode can be kind of a memorial to Terrell for because every life is important, and like you had mentioned, he was one of
800.
more than 800 children who died between 95 and 98 after their cases were brought to the attention of the Georgia Department of Human Services. So this is just one story of many that we don't know about, of children dying because of state departments failing to do their jobs. And we're not putting all the blame on them, because obviously it was the abusers who did this, but the people who are supposed to enforce the laws and react and protect, they could have prevented this. So it's still a percentage of their fault, and hopefully that kind of stuff is changing as time goes on. But yeah, so don't forget Terrell Peterson. If you want more information on this, there are a couple of good YouTube videos, and there's a few articles online about it. So that's where we got our information. If you just Google Terrell Peterson, you can learn more about it. So definitely let us know what you think of this case, or if you find any more information on this case. You can email us at vovpodcast@gmail.com. And also subscribe to our show if you enjoy it. And we'd really appreciate a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy the show. And if you'd like to support us, visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/vovpodcasts. And we'll put all these links in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else to say, Rosie?
Still suffering from jet lag.
So, thanks again for re-recording. The first time we recorded this, you were a lot more alert. You were in that pre-vacation excitement mode, and you were just ready to cover it. And I was so excited because I thought we had a really good sound setup, and then I listened back and realized that there was a really annoying high-frequency buzz going on the whole time, and I tried to EQ it out, but it just ruined the sound quality. And you heard that in last week's episode about sex trafficking, if you heard it, but we weren't able to re-record that because Rosie was 4,000 miles away. So I'm glad we were able to re-record this with better quality sound, and
yes,
moving forward, I'm going to do my best to make sure we have a good sound setup. Let us know how you feel about the sound right now. If it's good enough for you, then
it's good enough for us.
Yep, we'll keep using this setup. And yeah.
Cool. Next week's podcast is a surprise because we don't know what we're going to talk about yet.
Yeah. Weren't we talking about...
No, it's a surprise.
Okay.
It's a big surprise.
Now you're really setting it up. Don't get too excited about it. Alright, I suppose we'll stop rambling now, and thanks again for listening. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.